Everyone saw it happen. No one stepped in. Until one man did. On paper, Willow Creek looked like the kind of town where trouble ran out of places to hide. The streets were lined with clipped hedges and white fences. Porches wore their flags like quiet pledges, and the afternoon sun seemed to move more slowly over the sidewalks, as if it understood that this corner of the world required gentleness. The lawns were green even in late summer, the windows were clear, and the mailboxes had names carefully stenciled on them, names people recognized at the grocery store and at the Sunday bake sale. Everything looked composed, responsible, unshakable. It was the kind of place where a stranger might say nothing bad ever happens here, and the regulars would nod along because it felt true enough. Into this quiet order moved a set of wheels that had become part of the town's rhythm. The soft hum belonged to Margaret Hayes, a woman whose life had been bent but not broken by the crash that took her ability to walk years ago. Her wheelchair didn't announce a tragic ending, it announced a decision to keep going. Margaret had learned the curbs by memory, where the pavement dipped a little too sharply and where the branches of the old oak trees leaned into the sidewalk. She planned her errands with the precision of someone who knew that a good day often hinged on a series of small victories. The ramp behind the bakery, the gravel patch by the library, the uneven tile outside the florist, rich with petals, treacherous with gaps. These were the landmarks of her private map. Beside her, tethered to this daily geography by a leash and a vow older than words, trotted a golden retriever named Scout. He wasn't merely trained, he was attuned. Scout knew when Margaret's hands needed a steadying weight, when her breath quickened and the world felt too wide, when she needed to stop and just look up at the sky. He waited for her at door thresholds, shifted his body so that the wheels wouldn't roll too fast down slight slopes, and angled himself between her and carelessness when sidewalks narrowed. Theirs was not a story of pity, it was a story of partnership, rituals built from patience, glances, routine, and a bond that made sense of everything that had gone missing. In the morning, Margaret would guide her chair to the window and let the light pour across the rug. She would straighten the stacks of mail, make lists with neat handwriting, and decide on a route that always included the town square because the fountain there had become her metronome. She found restoration in the ordinary, the sound of a barista steaming milk 2 storefronts away, the squeak of a gate that needed oiling, the soft thud of basketballs at the park on Maple. If loneliness visited, it did so like a polite guest. It never shattered the place, it hovered around the edges, waiting for her to name it. And most days she refused. The people of Willow Creek recognized Margaret in the way a town recognizes one of its steady souls. Heads would tilt in greeting, hands lifted from steering wheels. A neighbor mowing his yard would pause long enough to wave. Their decency was genuine, yet contained, a kind of friendliness that respected distance but rarely crossed it. She received smiles like postcards, kind, brief, never quite enough to keep. When she wheeled past the grocery store, someone would hold the door, and she would thank them with a warmth that made the moment feel like more than a courtesy. But even in this choreography of civility, there was a quiet gap between acknowledgement and intimacy. People noticed, but they did not linger. They responded, but they did not ask. The town was good, yes, but it was also comfortable, and comfort can blur the sharper edges of empathy. Margaret never resented this. Instead, she became the sort of person who offered more than she received, because it was easier to give purpose than to ask for it. She remembered birthdays with handwritten notes for the shop owners who lined Main Street. She kept dog biscuits in a pouch for the neighborhood pets, Scout sitting quietly while she shared. She returned library books early with bookmarks tucked inside as little gifts. A stretch of her days belonged to small acts with large meanings, the quiet discipline of keeping promises to herself, the willingness to let gratitude pull more weight than grief. If her hands trembled sometimes when she reached for a can on a high shelf, she found a way to turn the reach into an exercise of faith in strangers. Scout made this easier. He watched her with a focus that felt like prayer. His eyes tracked the changing light, the approaching footsteps, the small shifts in Margaret's shoulders that preceded a turn or a stop. When she paused, he leaned in close to her leg support, not with urgency, but with assurance, anchoring her in ways a person might fail to do. At the fountain, she would rest and run her fingers through his fur, and the steadiness of his breathing invited her to match it. Passers-by sometimes commented on how well-trained he was, and she would smile, not because of the accuracy of the observation, but because it missed the truth. Scout wasn't just trained, He was devoted, and devotion reorders a life. There was in the texture of these afternoons a hum of resilience that blended almost invisibly with the sounds of the town. Children's laughter rolled over the square, and the elderly couple on the bench near the statue shared a thermos like a ritual. A delivery truck double-parked with a familiar impatience, and a bicyclist wove through the gaps with the grace of someone who knew this pattern by heart. Margaret belonged to all of it without ever occupying the center. The center, as it so often does in peaceful places, was reserved for the illusion that nothing could change in a way that hurt. This particular day, warm, brilliant, the kind of day that leaves soft edges on even the hardest memories, unfolded, with a predictability that soothed her. She adjusted the cushion under her, checked the battery indicator on the armrest, and made a mental note to pick up cinnamon from the corner store. She had read that scent could reset a restless mind. Scout's leash clipped with a quiet snap, and they moved together down the ramp, the threshold between private solace and public routine crossing under her wheels. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread and cut grass, and somewhere a radio played an old song that had outlived several summers. As she took the sidewalk toward the square, the familiar textures presented themselves like a sequence she could navigate, without looking up. The slight tilt of the curb by the mailbox, the long shadow thrown by the lamppost at this hour, the rougher concrete near the alley that required a small adjustment. She felt steady. She felt capable. The strength in her arms had been earned in long stretches of repetition that most people never have to learn. She preferred it that way not because it made her exceptional, but because it made her accountable to herself. She chose the long way around the grocery because the oak tree there gave a shade that felt like a favor. The town didn't ask much of her beyond what it asked of anyone. Be decent, pay attention, do no harm. And in that space she found room to be more than a circumstance. She observed details with a tenderness sharp, ened by gratitude. The way the baker used a cloth to polish a glass case until it held the reflection of the street. The way the florist misted petals in the heat to keep them open a little longer. The way the librarian tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear as if aligning the world one small gesture at a time. Life, even with its losses, contained a gentle architecture that made sense if she added to it whenever she could. Everything in this picture invited trust. The rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk kept time with the easy cadence of a town that believed itself safe. A pickup rolled by with its windows down, a golden retriever in the back, Scout watching with dignified interest rather than excitement. The park bells in the distance chimed the hour in a tone so soft it was nearly swallowed by the day. The square ahead shimmered slightly where the sun hit the fountain spray, and Margaret could already imagine the cool mist brushing her hands when she drew close enough to rest. She steered toward it, past the music store's display of guitars that caught the sunlight in their lacquered curves, past the pharmacy window with its neatly handwritten specials, past the bench where the chessboard always waited for a match. Her momentum was easy, her breath unhurried, her mind on cinnamon and a recipe card tucked into the third kitchen drawer. Scout matched her pace, head high, weaving the space between the frame of her chair and the edge of the world with practiced ease. 2. Children skipped a few steps to the side to make room and then returned to their game without looking back. A man in a suit checked his watch, then his phone, then the sky, doing math with his minutes. Margaret felt the small pleasure that comes from arriving at the place you intended, not because it is grand, but because it is yours in the ways that matter. She could already hear the fountain more clearly now, the rush smoothing into a constant tone that settled in the chest. The square offered the same promise it always did, a seat in the shade, the company of strangers who rarely asked but often witnessed, and the gentle order of a town that believed kindness could be left on a table like a tip. On a warm afternoon, Margaret wheels toward the town square, unaware of 3 loud teenage boys speeding down the same street. Evil doesn't always wear dark clothes. Sometimes it wears wealth, charm, and a family name that can erase any sin. They arrived in bursts of noise the town had learned to ignore, the low growl of tuned engines echoing off brick storefronts and glass windows polished to a shine. Chase Donovan liked to take the lead, not because he was the oldest, but because his confidence had been curated like a family heirloom. His father's name hung on plaques in charity hallways and golf club leaderboards, and the evidence of that name was stitched into the leather seats of the car Chase preferred, something expensive enough to signal that rules were negotiable. Blake, too. Arnair rode behind him, a careful mirror, made careless by proximity. He had a smile trained for photographs and a posture that suggested the world would always make space. Ryan Cole, quieter but no gentler, carried himself with the casual permission of a boy who had never needed to ask twice for anything. Together they formed a moving weather system, the kind that blew in and tilted the balance of a calm afternoon into something off-kilter. Their school records were immaculate, but only because immaculate meant curated. Private academies taught them Latin words and the choreography of influence, how to write essays that sounded like responsibility, and how to shake hands in a way that landed internships without interviews. They took weekend lessons that had nothing to do with humility, advanced driving on private tracks, leadership retreats. At lakeside properties, networking dinners where their fathers introduced them to men who spoke in numbers and nodded at the names of other men. They learned that doors opened because doors recognized who was knocking. They learned that consequences were a theory. Cars became their calling cards, not for the speed alone, but for what arrived with it, the promise that someone else would clean up. Chase's coupe wore a paint job that caught the sun like a signal flare. He liked to idle near storefronts just long enough to let the exhaust ripple across the sidewalk like a sigh. Blake swapped models as if they were shoes, brightness and chrome cycling in a performance of variety that said more about boredom than taste. Ryan's sedan was the quiet kind of expensive, the kind that made no sound beyond its efficiency, yet his quiet was not gentleness, it was calculation practiced until it looked like poise. The roads of Willow Creek, designed for carpools and grocery runs, adjusted under their tires as if the asphalt itself remembered who paid the taxes. What their families gave in public donations, they reclaimed in private indulgence. Fundraiser photos showed them in tuxedos next to their fathers, holding checks that would replace playground equipment and repaint the senior center. The same week, a backyard party would end with an uprooted mailbox by the park and a lawn left in tire tracks shaped like careless signatures. The boys spoke fluently in smiles for adults and in laughter that had edges when they were alone. They weren't monsters. Monsters would have been easier to spot. They were ordinary boys, sharpened by an inheritance that applauded boldness but forgot to teach the purpose of strength. Their reputations moved a step ahead of them, opening lanes and closing conversations. Teachers who tried to hold them after class found their reminders softened by a call from a board member. A store they crowded with noise on a Saturday afternoon would receive a Monday morning bouquet and a handwritten note signed by a parent with recognizable loops. The apologies were elegant, and that elegance made the memory of the disruption feel like a misunderstanding instead of a habit. The town, proud of its ability to forgive, became practiced at forgetting. Pranks shifted with the season and the need to feel alive. A row of construction cones rearranged into a maze that drivers had to weave through like a game. A banner hung at dawn across the school entrance, clever enough to be called harmless but pointed enough to land on the local news for a day. Lawn ornaments migrating overnight, a plastic flamingo appearing atop the gazebo, the sort of antics that left no bruises, but left a message about who had the power to redraw the lines. When complaints reached the homes on the hill, fathers deflected with a chuckle and mothers suggested boys would be boys, and the phrase did the work of varnish, smoothing over rough edges until they gleamed. It wasn't that the town ved them. It was that the town found it easier to love the stories their families told about them. Bright futures, scholarships, potential shaped like legacy. The boys wore these narratives like tailored jackets, too young to understand how heavy they could become, too enthralled to notice that such garments also conceal. In their orbit, kindness was transactional and respect flowed uphill. They could be charming when an audience required it, helping a tourist lift a stroller down the market steps for the selfie that would follow, posting the kind of captions that harvest approval. They knew how to perform goodness, and performance can quiet even an attentive crowd. Against this curated world, Margaret's quiet life drew a contrast so clear it might as well have been painted. Where the boys chased spectacle, she tended to routine. Where they saw the square as a stage, she saw it as shelter. Where their power announced itself in noise, her dignity traveled in silence. Even without knowing her name, they would have recognized the type, someone who did not belong to their economy of attention. In a town that worked hard to keep its lines straight, their presence disturbed the geometry, her presence repaired it. If they had paused long enough to see her as a person, they might have noticed the steadiness of her hands even when the ground was uneven, the way she made space for strangers in a way they had never learned to make space for themselves. On this warm afternoon, the spect. Akel followed its script. Engines arrived before faces, the square registering the sound first, the gliding rumble that signaled a shift in temperature. Chase traced a slow path along the curb, not speeding, merely insisting on being noticed. Blake leaned back as if the sky belonged to him, his sunglasses reflecting a scatter of storefront signs and summer hats. Ryan checked a watch he did not need to check, a gesture worn into habit by the expectation that his time was more valuable than anyone else's. They parked with the kind of precision that reads as entitlement, close to the crosswalk, close to the center, where arriving and being seen are the same thing. Their entrance into the market lane felt choreographed. Designer clothes carried the softness that comes from never being thrown into a wash that runs too hot. Sneakers showed no scuffs because scuffs are what's removed when someone else cleans. Their laughter did not erupt, it flowed, low and confident, the sound itself a claim on the air. They passed a group of kids trading baseball cards and left behind a wake of fragrance and suggestion, a reminder that part of growing up for them meant leaving reminders of themselves wherever they went. A delivery driver paused with a hand truck, not because he needed to let them pass, but because the habit of stepping aside had settled into the town's muscles. To passers-by, they might have looked like promise. 3 boys on the edge of adulthood, handsome in the way money can make anyone appear intentional. But promise without purpose grows restless, and restlessness seeks a stage. They scanned for one with practiced eyes, the kind of eyes that measure a place not by its beauty, but by its usefulness. A spectacle needs a focus, something small to inflate, something ordinary to rearrange into a story they could tell each other later, stripped of context and polished into pride. The market's awning cast a cool shade over fruit crates and the day's chalkboard specials. Voices blended into a comfortable murmur. Within that murmur moved a shape that did not pose a challenge so much as present an option. Margaret's wheels approached the lane with the gentle persistence of habit, Scout's pace aligning with her breath. She did not expect space to be made for her. She created it with patience. In another town, all of this would have passed like a cloud, noticed, then gone. In Willow Creek, on this afternoon, it drew the kind of attention that does not announce itself, but shifts the air a fraction of a degree. Chase saw her first, the way the light caught on the metal of the wheels and the golden fur that moved beside them. Something in his expression changed. No rage, no urgency, just the small ignition of opportunity found. Blake and Ryan followed the line of his gaze, curiosity sparking but still shapeless, waiting to be told what shape to take. There are moments when character reveals itself not with a shout but with a glance, and this was one of them, a choice, forming at the edge of an easy afternoon. The boys notice Margaret and Scout outside a local market. Chase smirks, whispering something the others can't hear as they walk toward her. When cruelty finds no resistance, it grows bolder, until someone dares to stop it. The market lane narrowed into a shallow corridor of shade canvas awnings stitching together a strip of cool air against the late afternoon warmth. Tires ticked as they cooled. A steady metronome behind the chatter and the faint splash from the square's fountain. Margaret guided her wheels toward the grocer's entrance, with the practiced patience of someone who had measured this stretch 100 times. Scout's pace matched her breath, every step calibrated, his shoulder brushing lightly against the chair as if to say the ground beneath them could be trusted. That trust thinned as the noise shifted, and the space in front of her reassembled into a circle that had not been invited. The boys moved the way crowds make room for, not because they should, but because habit had convinced everyone it was simpler. Chase drifted to her left, his shadow crossing the spokes of her wheel like a smudge. Blake angled into the right-hand gap, close enough that the chrome edge of a display rack reflected the blur of his designer jacket. Ryan hung back just far enough to appear like a spectator to the scene he had helped create, the angle of his stance closing the lane without needing to lift a hand. The market's low hum continued. But its warmth thinned. Sound can be a temperature, and this felt colder. Margaret recognized the choreography too late to reroute. The path to her left was now a wall of shoulders. The space behind was shifting with bodies that had decided to pause for reasons they would later struggle to explain. She steadied her hands on the wheels, the grip more for grounding than for motion, and felt Scout's weight shift closer to her footrest, a quiet pivot from companion to shield. His head lifted, ears forward, eyes fixed not on faces but on patterns, angles of knees, twitch of toes, the small signals that advertise intention before the mind does. One of the boys made a grand show of concern, sweeping his hand toward the wheel as if volunteering help. The gesture traveled past the boundary of courtesy and into the theater of power, fingers grazing the rim and giving it a thoughtless spin that turned her chair a few inches off-center. The movement wasn't violent, but it was careless in the particular way that tells a person they have become a prop. Margaret's stomach tipped with the turn, not dizzy but unmoored. Scout stiffened and braced. A living counterweight, he leaned into the moment as if to make the ground heavier. Laughter followed, not loud, but shaped to be heard, the kind that finds its own echo even in open air. It spread to the edges of the circle and returned with a polish, surfaced in a small chorus of amused disbelief. A vendor looked up from arranging peaches, and then looked back down, fingers suddenly slower, the arrangement now an excuse to remain neutral. Two teenagers holding paper cups paused mid-sip, the straws hovering like uncertain instruments. In the doorway of the bakery, a woman pressed her palm to the frame, the metal cool beneath her skin, her eyes moving without the rest of her shifting an inch. Everyone noticed, no one moved. Margaret's hands tightened on the handles. Control in a wheelchair can be a kind of conversation with the ground, she spoke firmly now, palms flattening, elbows steady. She pulled herself back to center, a small correction that felt, in this narrow ring, both necessary and defiant. Scout let out a single bark, sharp and clipped, an alert that landed with more clarity than any sentence could have. It wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. He stood between Margaret and the nearest forward step, fur lifted by the mere suggestion of danger, gaze unwavering, the leash line quiet and tight like a promise. Another boy lifted his cup and tipped it with a flick that meant nothing to him and too much to the creature at Margaret's side. A ribbon of sweet drink arced and splattered, not a drench but enough to darken Scout's fur and leave a cold line against warm afternoon air. The smell of sugar went sticky in the heat. The reaction followed like a reflex, a few gasps, a shifting of weight, the sound of shoes adjusting against the subtle grit of the market's walkway. Scout flinched at the splash, then steadied himself. LF. Pressing closer, his ribs brushing the frame of the chair in a way that translated directly into Margaret's bones. "I am here! I am here!" The boy's laughter sharpened, gaining edges that could scrape. It was not rage, not even hatred. It was the thrill of exerting gravity and watching objects bend. Margaret's breath came slow by effort. She knew how to slow breath in storms. She had learned that in rehab, evenings stretched with exercises that measured progress in inches and minutes. She focused on the sensation of the armrest beneath her fingers, the slight texture of the grip, the exact weight of Scout's presence against her right side. She did the math of survival in one-syllable units. Hold, breathe, hold, breathe. The circle tightened by half a step, less a charge than a closing in, a choreography that suggested control without risking consequence. Chase drew his foot back in a performance of escalation, not with impact in mind, but with the spectacle of intention. He swung his leg forward in a hard stomp that landed close enough to Scout's forepaws to startle him without making contact, the sound of flat crack against the market stone. The stomp carried all the message they wanted delivered, and none of the mark that would invite accountability. It was the difference between harm and intimidation can be its own kind of wound. Silence rippled outward. The square beyond their circle went strangely quiet, as if the fountain had turned down its volume. The moment stretched with the heaviness of a held note. A child somewhere asked a question and was shushed. The florist's sprayer hissed and then stopped mid-mist, a spray of droplets suspended briefly, catching the light before gravity reclaimed them. Margaret's heartbeat registered as a low drum in her ears. Scout's whine was small, unhappy not from pain but from the confusion that comes when devotion meets a world that does not understand its rules. The paralysis of the bystanders developed into a shape that might have been called complicity if named aloud. But no one named it. People love towns like Willow Creek because they believe they know what to do in them. They hold doors, they make room. They call out "have a good one" with sincerity that isn't performative. What they do less well when pressed without warning is interrupt a script written by those who are as practiced at performing dominance as others are at performing decency. The hesitation was not emptiness, it was a tangle of questions. Is this my place? Will this get worse? Will someone else act? And in that tangle the moment lengthened. Margaret didn't plead. She worked the only levers she trusted. She kept Scout close with a slight pressure of the leash and straightened her shoulders, not in pride but in refusal to fold. Her mind made a quick ledger of exit paths and found none that weren't through them. She thought of the fountain, so near she could almost feel the drift of mist, a detail that now felt like a mile away. She thought of cinnamon, of lists, of routines that steadied her even when the day did not. She thought of how Scout's loyalty had taught her something she never named but always used, the dignity to claim space without a fight. The boys, sensing the effect of their theater, held the pause like performers who know silence can multiply attention. Chase's eyes flicked to the edges of the crowd, measuring the audience. Blake adjusted his jacket, a movement so small and deliberate it read as entitlement more than nerves. Ryan shifted his weight and kept the lane closed with the geometry of his stance. Their work was done, or nearly so. Intimidation creates its own proof by becoming the story told about it. They had turned a woman and her dog into a spectacle, and the town's stillness was the applause they preferred. Noisy in its quiet, the market reclaimed a partial hum, and in that return the smallest sounds became announcements. A metal table leg scraped lightly against the pavement from the direction of the cafe. A ceramic cup touched down with the soft, certain weight of a decision. The circle didn't turn to look. It didn't need to. The air changed as if a door had opened to a cooler room, and the temperature of the scene shifted by a degree that everyone felt in their skin before they could explain it. A man at a nearby cafe sets his coffee cup down, eyes locked on the scene, calm, deliberate, dangerous. Some men carry their wars inside them, and sometimes the battlefield finds them again. He sat where the light worked like a balm near the window of a modest cafe that made its own bread and brewed its coffee dark enough to quiet idle thoughts. The chair faced the market lane by habit, not because he needed to see, but because years had taught him that seeing was how days stayed orderly. Ethan Cole had chosen Willow Creek for the hush between sounds, for the way mornings opened their hands without asking what he had to trade, for the quiet responsibility of a town that seemed to know the value of ordinary decency. He lived a few streets away in a rented house that kept secrets well, a place where the wind in the pines could steady what the nights sometimes disturbed. He wore the look of a man who had built a discipline out of healing. The body that once carried more weight than any uniform could bear had leaned into a gentler strength. He ran the lakeside path at dawn with a pack that forgot ambition and favored endurance. He carried groceries in 2 balanced bags because balance mattered even when it was not required. He listened to the radio on low, preferring older songs that did not jolt him into memories. The sleeve of his shirt often hid the edge of a scar, and the quiet around him hid more. The men he had served with had names that still moved in his head like constellations, each fixed and bright and irretrievably distant. Sleep arrived most nights, but not always in a single piece. Sometimes it broke into segments and left him awake at 3, the hour when the world confessed its fragility. He would stand by the sink and let water run over his hands, focusing on the cold as if it could persuade his mind to settle. He kept a green notebook on the counter where he wrote lists that had nothing to do with combat readiness: replace porch bulb, oil the door hinge, call the mechanic about the rattle he heard only when it rained. These small, manageable assignments felt like a kindness to himself, a way of defining rescue as the accumulation of ordinary tasks performed on time. The cafe helped with the rest. The owner knew him as the quiet regular who read manuals the way others read novels, who turned cups so their handles pointed inward, who returned chairs to their precise angles when he left. He preferred the seat by the window because the view offered uncomplicated information: who entered, who exited, where the nearest exit remained clear. The shadows changed with the hour. He did not memorize faces to keep a roster of threats. He recorded them as a student of patterns. In another life, this habit had kept him alive. In this life, it kept him from drifting. The sound that pulled his attention was not loud. It was the shift in tone that happens when laughter enters a place as a claim rather than a celebration. Ethan had learned to hear intention the way some men learned to hear music. He felt it now loosening the cafe's hum. He recognized the cars before he saw the boys. Engines often revealed character, and these engines spoke a language that expected doors to open without knocking. The market's air tightened. He did not stand. He watched, the way a shoreline watches the first gathering line of a storm. Through the glass, the afternoon arranged itself into a tableau he had seen in countless forms, in towns with names he could not pronounce, and in alleys where maps were worthless. The vulnerable became a stage, and those who needed an audience assembled without admitting it. He saw the shape form before others did. The wheel turned inches off center, the protective lean of the dog, the small corrections the woman made to reassert control. He did not need to guess at her courage. He could read it in the way her shoulders lifted and set, not to announce defiance, but to remain human inside a narrowing circle. Memory does not always arrive as pictures. Sometimes it arrives as sensation, a pressure change in the air, a particular tremor in the hands. Ethan felt the old signals flicker through him. He had known rooms where men did not return, street corners where kindness failed to cross the distance in time, stairwells where a single misstep meant a name would be carved into a wall thousands of miles away. He had also known days when one person's decision to move forward turned an ending into a rescue. The images that surfaced were not cinematic. They were tactile, sand in the teeth, a door that opened too easily, the way a medic's shoulder felt when he shifted weight to lift a stretcher. He remembered the face of a boy who had been brave without a witness. He remembered holding a line until help arrived and the line did not break. He remembered, most of all, the vow that had survived after he folded his uniform for the last time, to recognize danger early and step toward it in a way that did not multiply it. He watched the dog, because the dog revealed everything. Loyalty is not rhetorical in animals, it is practiced, rehearsed, absolute. The way the retriever positioned himself said as much about the scene as any raised voice could have. He traced the angles, the left shoulder of the boy on the perimeter blocking the avenue of retreat, the forward lean of the one nearest the wheel, the careful stance of the third who preferred to control the narrative from a step back. He noticed the bystanders' hands pausing above fruit and pastry, their eyes collecting without coordinating. The sile. NT struggle between instinct and inertia. Justice, for Ethan, had long ceased to be an idea. It was a skill set that began with breath. He set his cup down and let his spine lengthen, the motion more about purpose than posture. He understood that any intervention carried with it the risk of escalation. He had trained himself to enter with clarity that prevented panic from rehearsing its worst versions. His decisions no longer required a committee in his head. They followed a familiar path: scan, assess, choose, move. He let his mind calm into the checklist that erased fear by turning it into method. He did not think of himself as a hero. The wars had cautioned him against such myths. What they left him with was something quieter, a duty not to look away when the math of power and vulnerability tipped so far it threatened to break a person. He recognized that the moment was not asking for spectacle. It was asking for interruption executed with the precision of someone who respects the boundary between courage and aggression. He knew he would not place hands, would not raise a voice, would not turn this narrow lane into a courtroom. He would bring steadiness to a place that had lost it and create a space wide enough for decency to step back in. The decision formed not as lightning, but as daylight gathering itself. His body knew it before language did. The same muscles that carried stretchers and steadied ladders now prepared for something simpler: to stand, to be seen, to alter. The temperature of a scene without provoking combustion. He understood that his presence alone, properly calibrated, could reopen exits that had been closed by arrogance. He pictured the path he would take through the cafe door, the exact angle that would allow him to arrive without forcing anyone to step into him, the spot on the pavement where his shadow would register within the boy's peripheral vision. He would place himself between harm and target without addressing them as enemies, and by refusing the script of confrontation, he would rewrite the ending. He thought briefly of the men he had lost and of the values they had hauled across continents like heavy gear. Loyalty that did not evaporate when cameras turned away, courage measured in restraint rather than impact, protection as a craft rather than a pose. He thought of the woman's hands on the wheel, and the dog's unwavering stance, and the way the townspeople wanted to be their better selves but did not yet know how. The ache in his chest was not anger, it was recognition. He had been built for moments like this, and he had not retired that part of himself. He breathed once more and rose, letting each motion declare itself without aggression. The cup met the saucer with a sound that carried farther than it should have, a small, certain note that found the scene and settled there. The chair slid back with no scrape, because he always lifted its legs. He moved toward the door, not as a charge, but as a certainty taking shape, the kind of movement that tells a gathering storm that the land beneath it has decided where it will stand. Outside, the air waited, and the market held its breath. Ethan stands, every motion slow and intentional. The sound of his boots on pavement silences the laughter. True strength doesn't shout it, steps forward when everyone else steps back. Ethan stepped out of the cafe and into the square as if the air itself had requested an adjustment. The day kept its brightness, but the quality of it changed around him, as though the light acknowledged a new center of gravity. He didn't accelerate or posture. He moved with the steadiness of someone who understood that the first gift a protector offers is composure. Each footfall landed with quiet intent, paced to the rhythm of a breath that did not waver. And the market absorbed the sound like a chapel receiving a prayer. He kept his hands visible and still, fingers relaxed at his sides, shoulders aligned, chin level, the quiet geometry of a man who knew that balance persuades, more effectively than volume. The circle ahead of him remained closed but began to show seams. People who had been watching without will began to find it. Ethan's presence carried a subtle instruction, not through words but through example, that stillness can be both shield and signal. He calculated angles as he approached, tracking the nearest objects that could become hazards. A cart left too near the curb, a crate jutting into the lane, the slick paw. Teach where a drink had already turned the stone a darker shade. He also tracked the human variables, the way Margaret held the wheels steady as if anchoring herself to the earth, the precise line of Scout's body pressed between devotion and alertness, the fidgeting shoulders of boys unused to a gaze that didn't flinch. He entered the perimeter without asking permission, which is what authority looks like when it refuses to dress itself in threat. He set his stance so that his body became a quiet barrier, absorbing attention that had been aimed like a dare at the most vulnerable person in the space. The proximity was deliberate but not invasive, the distance measured to allow everyone a path out that did not require humiliation. Ethan never once squared off. Instead, he angled his frame in a way that kept Margaret within his sphere of care while returning open lanes to the boys who had tried to erase them. It was not an argument. It was architecture. The boys registered him with the quick assessment of people trained to read audiences. They saw no raised fists, no clenched jaw, no immediate threat they could exploit. What they saw unsettled them more, a man who had no interest in their script. Their laughter tried to hold its edge and failed to find it. The smirks worked hard and found no purchase. They resorted to the tactics that had always served them. Sarcasm sharpened to pass for confidence, performative indifference designed to mock concern. But their routine hit the soft W. All of Ethan's unshakable calm and slid down it like dull chalk. Tension rose not as a flare but as a tide. Power had entered the space in a form they did not recognize, a version of strength that governed itself. Ethan's voice, when he finally allowed it into the moment, carried the controlled warmth of a steady hand. He calibrated its level to the square and not to the boys, speaking into the scene rather than at it. The words themselves did less work than the tone, which prioritized order over ego, clarity over reproach. The sound granted bystanders permission to locate themselves on the right side of their own hesitation, and a subtle reordering began. A vendor shifted a crate, widening the lane. A parent guided a child away with gentleness instead of fear. The market's hum found a note of mutual agreement. Ethan didn't lecture the boys, he refused to feed the performance. He held posture like a thesis and patience like a proof, modeling a discipline that did not require compliance to remain valid. He let the silence between phrases extend long enough to be uncomfortable, not to shame, but to remove the oxygen from the spectacle. He tracked breathing patterns the way a medic tracks pulse, who sped up, who steadied, who searched for a new role now that the audience had been reclaimed by decency. He registered small details, the way Chase's shoulders rolled to disguise uncertainty, the way Blake's hands went to his pockets then withdrew as if pockets might look like retreat. The way Ryan glanced at the edges of the crowd and found fewer approving eyes than before. Margaret felt the shift, not because the circle physically opened yet, but because the air at her back no longer felt unguarded. Scout detected it too, his body softened without surrendering vigilance, ears maintaining their angle while his tail lowered from rigid line to quiet readiness. Ethan didn't touch either of them. He knew that some forms of comfort become complications in public spaces. He offered proximity instead, the respectful kind that tells the threatened that someone has stepped into the accounting with them, that the math now includes a variable strong enough to alter the sum privilege attempted one more rehearsal of itself. The boys exchanged the kind of smiles that had always coalesced into control. One shifted a foot as if to reclaim ground, and another threw his shoulders back in the mimicry of dominance. Ethan answered with a simple recentering of his weight, a tiny adjustment that redistributes intent without adding heat. It was the language of advanced restraint, to block without boxing in, to declare a perimeter without drawing a weapon, to insist on order by embodying it so completely that argument looks like childish noise. The crowd's awareness matured into a hum of solidarity. People felt permitted to think clearly again. A hand that had hovered over a phone now used it to call for assistance rather than to capture the scene for entertainment. A store own. R moved a sign stand from the walkway as if inviting the afternoon back to its rightful arrangement. The market lane widened by half an arm's length and then another. The permission to disengage had been returned, and yet no one ran. They remained to witness a standard being set that did not require a villain to be humiliated in order for a victim to be protected. Ethan spoke again, keeping the timbre where a nervous system could meet it without misreading it as a dare. The cadence offered the boys a way to exit without theater, a route that did not require them to lose face to end the harm. He had learned long ago that most conflicts end well when someone offers a better role to play. He granted them one now. Young men who could choose restraint, who could leave a space better than they found it, who could remember themselves differently by the time dinner came. He did not promise consequences. He implied expectations. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding in a single piece. The fountain's mist reached the edge of the market lane and made the light glitter again as if the square were reclaiming its weather. Scout's attention remained fixed, yet his stance eased by a degree that only a practiced observer would see. Ethan filmed none of this with his mind for later pride. He understood that true interventions are as much about calming a place as they are about correcting a person. The outcome he wanted was simple, a safe exit, a crowd realigned to deader instincts, a lesson that did not require a wound to make itself memorable. The boys hovered at the edge of a decision. Their performances had always been sustained by reflexive applause, and applause had thinned. Chase's expression flickered. Blake's attention slid toward the idle cars as if considering whether to transform the afternoon back into noise. Ryan's jaw tightened, a small rebellion against the discomfort of not ruling a scene that had been theirs a moment before. Ethan did nothing to rush them. He let choice reveal character at its own pace. He knew that urgency would make mistakes more likely, and mistakes are where people get hurt. The moment held a precise balance, the principle of restraint against the gravity of provocation. The crowd's center of attention narrowed to a fine point, that small locus where one decision can tilt a day into regret or into mercy. Ethan kept breathing, kept standing, kept everything about himself available to be read as safety rather than threat. His presence made a promise that had nothing to do with domination, an assurance that everyone would be allowed to walk away intact if they chose to let the better story win. A hand lifted. It rose from the nearest shoulder, a motion rehearsed in 1,000 smaller moments when touch became ownership, and moved toward Ethan's upper arm with the tentative arrogance of someone unaccustomed to being denied. The square inhaled as a single creature, the air tightening like a cord drawn to the limit of its string. Ethan's weight shifted by a fraction, not backward and not forward, but into a steadiness that turned contact into a mirror. The fingers hovered within inches of fabric, stalled by a presence that did not break and did not bite. And the world funneled its attention into that sliver of space where decision lives. One of the boys reaches toward Ethan's shoulder, palm open and intent unsteady, and the square holds its breath as the hand hovers a breath away, suspended between escalation and retreat. Sometimes justice is a whisper that silences every shout. The hand hovered and the square balanced on the finest edge of decision, yet the moment did not break into spectacle because Ethan refused to let it, holding the scene with a steadiness that drew heat out of the air and left only shape, intention, and consequence. He did not seize or shove or flare, he simply let his presence deepen its weight until the space between the reaching palm and his shoulder became a mirror that showed the boy exactly what he was about to do. And the reflection itself was disarming. The fingers lost their certainty, the wrist faltered, and the gesture collapsed into the harmless drift of a hand returning to its owner, the body behind it suddenly aware that it had been measured by something beyond bravado. The square exhaled, and in that breath the definition of strength changed in a way everyone could feel. Ethan remained composed, feet planted as if he had grown from that patch of stone, posture quiet and exact, attention arranged to hold care and control at once. He allowed no triumph to surface, no victory to announce itself, because this was not a contest won, this was a storm redirected before it gathered enough wind to name. He kept his arms still and visible, his shoulders relaxed, the simple lines of his stance communicating a boundary more convincingly than any raised voice could have hoped to achieve. The boy who had nearly escalated found himself standing before an authority that asked nothing demanded nothing, and yet left no room for harm. What might have become the theater of dominance dissolved into something cleaner. Ethan's discipline restrained the situation the way a seasoned captain trims a sail before a gust. No heroics, only precision applied at the right second. The crowd registered it as a lesson, even if no one said so. People who had gathered layers of helplessness over the last minutes began to shed them without quite knowing how. The vendor who had frozen behind a stack of peaches found his hands moving again, not to hide but to help, nudging the crate back to widen the lane and restore the possibility of passage. The woman in the bakery doorway stepped inside long enough to pick up her phone and notify those who answer such calls, her movements brisk and unshaking now that a standard had been set in the open. The boys sensed the shift more acutely than anyone else. Their confident choreography faltered, not because they had been shamed or shouted down, but because the script they relied upon had been quietly removed from the stage. Without the fuel of attention, their smirks dropped like props at the end of a rehearsal. Their eyes flicked between Ethan's stillness and the crowd's new composure and found no foothold. False confidence, which draws its power from borrowed awe, cannot survive in a climate governed by restraint. They had come for noise and discovered that the air itself was no longer available for that purpose. Ethan did not look at them as antagonists. He looked at the scene as a system regaining equilibrium. He shifted half a step to create a better corridor behind him, the small practical move of a man who invests authority in architecture rather than volume. Margaret felt the current of safety return to her, like a tide that had been temporarily claimed by weather and now rolled back to shore. Her hands eased their grip on the wheels without surrendering readiness. Scout sensed the meeting point finally tipping away from threat, his body lowering into a stance of attentive calm, the line of the leash slackening a fraction that meant more than any announcement could have. Phones rose, but differently now, not just to capture the view for later consumption, but to document accurately, to signal accountability, to connect this place to the people entrusted with codifying order. A teenager who had watched quietly dialed with the same care a librarian uses when shelving a fragile book, his voice measured even though his heart still worked at a faster cadence. Across the square, a shop owner stepped outside and positioned himself at the edge of the sidewalk, not as a challenger, but as a witness willing to stand in the light, the kind of presence that turns onlookers into participants in the keeping of peace. Ethan's restraint became the center of gravity, and around it, behaviors realigned. He never advanced, he never retreated. He gave the boys the dignity of a path out that did not require them to fracture. He held the line that said harm would not be allowed to bloom, and he did it without pressing anyone into a corner. Leadership, when practiced without vanity, invites others to reclaim their best selves, and that invitation hummed through the square, until even those who had hesitated at first could feel it extend toward them. The moral lesson was not a sermon delivered from height, it was a floor plan that demonstrated how care can carry more weight than force when drawn with a steady hand. For the boys, realization arrived not as panic, but as a dimming of illusion. Chase discovered that charisma fails when it meets unflinching calm. His shoulders, trained to roll through discomfort as if discomfort were a shallow puddle, settled into the honest angle of a young man who had run out of practiced moves. Blake learned that posture can be neutralized by poise, the placement of his hands, the tilt of his chin. The little rehearsed gestures of bravado felt suddenly theatrical to himself. Ryan recognized that control based on crowd response is not control at all. When the crowd's gaze reoriented toward decency, the structure he relied upon lost its scaffolding. Each boy stood in the new climate and found it impossible to pretend that they were still directing weather. Margaret watched the unwinding with a clarity that belonged to those who know how to survive without surrendering their core. She understood that the absence of cruelty is not the same as the presence of safety. Ethan was delivering the latter. He did it without spectacle, and that made the safety sturdier. Scout remained close, a living bridge between fear and composure, his presence asserting a truth older than the moment that loyalty can stand quietly and still be the largest force in a room. The dynamic had shifted not because someone had won, but because someone had held firm to what should never be negotiable. The onlookers' passivity melted into disciplined attention. People made space with purpose rather than avoidance. They allowed sightlines for those who needed to see and routes for those who needed to leave. A man who had been frozen by uncertainty stepped forward to steady a fallen sign and then stayed where he was, a calm figure marking the boundary of the gathering. Two teenagers moved to stand beside the vendor, still anonymous, still ordinary, but newly aligned with the work of keeping order. The square felt different because the people in it had remembered a simple truth: the opposite of cruelty is not silence, it is care expressed in time. Ethan's eyes moved once more around the perimeter, confirming what the crowd already sensed, that the danger had not only ebbed but had been replaced by something constructive. He reserved no glory for himself, leaving the heroics to movies and the heavy lifting to systems designed for such calls. He adjusted his distance from Margaret and Scout by a quiet measure, enough to remain present without hovering, to invite their autonomy back into the scene. The lesson he offered the boys, authority without cruelty, rested now in the arrangement of people and objects, in the reappearance of ease across faces, in the way the square's sounds began to knit themselves together again into the fabric of a town that wants to be decent and, with reminders, can be. Then the sound reached them, distant at first, more pressure than noise, a rising thread that wove itself through the market's resumed conversation until it drew every ear. Sirens do not simply announce, they organize time. Heads turned toward the street beyond the square, the crowd parting along an instinctive line that kept walkways clear while leaving witness in place. The boys, stripped of the attention they had expected to surf, stood oddly small against the awnings, each one calculating outcomes with a new mathematics that included accountability. Phones lowered in favor of clear sightlines, shoulders angled to allow responders a straight path, lips pressed into the kind of silence that respects the work coming toward them. Ethan did what he always does when the next chapter belongs to another set of hands. He stepped back by half steps that looked like nothing, until someone trained to see noticed the care he took to remove himself from the center without abandoning the people he had steadied. He found a place at the edge where his presence could still absorb any late-breaking flare without casting a shadow over the proceeding. G.S. No one would remember him for a pose because he offered none. He allowed the square to reclaim itself. The sirens swell and blue lights spill across the storefront glass as the crowd opens a clear lane, and while all eyes angle toward the approaching cruisers, Ethan drifts 2 paces into the shade, choosing the margin over the spotlight and vanishing into anonymity just as authority arrives. Sometimes the quiet man who saves a life has already given up parts of his own. The cruisers slid into the lane with a measured authority that reorganized the afternoon, their lights bending across the storefront glass like blue water. Officers stepped out with practiced calm, moving in a pattern that prioritized clarity over drama, and the square responded with the ordered hush that always follows the arrival of accountability. In the maid space, the scene became legible, a woman steady in her chair, a golden dog at her side like living loyalty. 3 boys who looked suddenly younger than the noise they had brought, and a man just beyond the center, anchored in stillness that seemed to hold the air together. One officer paused mid-stride, not from uncertainty but from recognition. Training created categories and memory supplied names, and the two met in the clean line of a man who knew exactly what he was seeing. Without announcing it aloud, the truth traveled through posture, hand signals, and the softened angle of a gaze that adjusts when it finds a familiar standard. There are forms you wear and uniforms you carry, and the latter are visible to those who understand the weight. The quiet in the officer's face said it first. The man in the margin was not a stranger to discipline, he was its native tongue. The acknowledgement moved through the ranks like a current, subtle yet decisive. The officers widened the corridor around Margaret and Scout, their presence building a second boundary that confirmed the first. In the crowd, whispers assembled out of fragments: military service, special operations, the kind of work most people hear about in headlines but never truly understand. Words like Navy and SEAL surfaced without need for confirmation, as if the square itself had drawn the conclusion. The title did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as context, clarifying why calm had lifted a heavier weight than force could have managed. Margaret felt the atmosphere change in a way that touched something deep and quiet inside her. Relief is not just the absence of fear, it is the presence of safety, affirmed by a larger order. Her hands eased from their controlled grip on the wheels, though her dignity remained upright. Scout adjusted with her, a synchronized shift that looked like muscle memory because it was devotion practiced over years. They were no longer alone inside a circle they had not invited. The town had remembered how to stand, and the man who led them to it had stepped back to ensure the space stayed theirs. For Ethan, the recognition, unspoken yet unmistakable, opened a corridor into memory he did not visit often. It arrived as sensation rather than scene, the weight of desert heat on skin, the metal tang of dust, the precise pressure of a harness across shoulders during a lift that could not fail. It brought with it the faces of men he kept bright but distant, not to forget, but to function. Among those faces lived one afternoon he could never reorder, the kind that builds a second heartbeat under the first. There had been a civilian in a doorway where a safe corridor should have existed, a calculation made too quickly by someone else, a timing error that turned seconds into a loss. He had carried that absence across oceans and years, smoothing its edges with service and silence, never mistaking quiet for peace. This day did not erase that day. Redemption does not rewrite history, it restores proportion. As the officers navigated their roles with professionalism, Ethan recognized what his presence had provided, the extra sliver of time in which harm fails to bloom, the gentle rerouting that lets dignity survive. He had not imposed himself on the moment, and that mattered. He had joined the scene just long enough to change its weather, and then yielded to the systems designed to finish the work. The balance felt right in his bones, not triumphant, not even satisfying, but correctly aligned, as if a long-held vow had found a place to rest for a while. Around him, the crowd transformed further from passive witness to respawn. Seeable community. Statements were offered with clarity. Details were reported in sequence rather than sensation. Those who had recorded lifted their screens only when asked, handing over video not as trophies but as tools. The boys' earlier bravado thinned into a realism that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with the presence of boundaries they had not expected to meet. They learned something more durable than fear, that a town can choose its center, and sometimes that center is restraint shaped by duty. Margaret's gratitude flowed the way water finds its level. No theatrics, just an honest settling of emotion into the shape the moment allowed. She met Ethan's eyes across the small distance he had deliberately maintained and offered a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than any speech. It said that the world can still be dependable when individuals refuse to let it fracture, that loyalty takes many forms, some on 4 legs, some on 2 feet, some carried in the quiet governance of a steady spine. Scout, sensing the human exchange, leaned fractionally toward Ethan, as if recognizing a kinship in the way he stood guard without claim. Ethan accepted none of it as tribute. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a man can collect is admiration untethered to responsibility. He cataloged the faces not to fix them in memory, but to confirm that everyone had a safe path out of this frame, the officers with their professionalism intact, the bystanders arriving at a better idea of themselves, the boys with a new map for conduct that did not require spectacle. The woman and her dog restored to their rightful place within a day that had threatened to exclude them. The internal ledger that governed him ticked one careful line, order re-established without harm. At the edge of the square, a small action found its consequence. A bystander, steady-handed and clear-eyed now that the crisis had softened into process, saved and shared the clean chronology of what had happened, the approach, the encirclement, the quiet barrier, the restoration, not for entertainment, but to testify, not for clout, but for record. The clip moved from one device to another, out of the square and into the wider pattern where communities learn from one another how to behave under pressure. The story began its inevitable travel, trimmed of rumor by the clarity of restraint on display. A bystander's phone upload leaves the square and surges into timelines beyond the town, the images of calm intervention gathering momentum within hours, drawing unseen eyes toward Willow Creek while Ethan remains at the margin, already slipping back into the quiet that keeps him whole. One act of courage can ripple farther than any weapon ever could. The video left Willow Creek the way rain leaves a roofline, gathering momentum as it slid from one edge to another until it became part of a wider weather system. First it lived in group chats and neighborhood pages, PR, azed in simple comments that read like exhalations. Finally someone did the right thing. Then it pushed past the borders of familiarity and found the larger streams, where algorithms recognized the anatomy of a moment people wanted to understand. The frames were clean, a narrow market lane, a woman steady in her chair, a golden retriever poised like a vow, a circle of boys learning that attention is not the same as authority, and a man whose calm rewrote the scene. The absence of spectacle was the spectacle. Viewers lingered not on conflict but on restraint, replaying the angles to study how a person can hold a line without breaking anyone who stands near it. Morning shows called it quiet heroism, because the quiet could not be ignored. Commentators accustomed to framing events as clashes of sides spoke instead about standards, about the recognizable shape of dignity and the rare courage of de-escalation. A retired teacher in Ohio used the clip to start a classroom conversation about what leadership looks like when you don't have a title. In Arizona, a counselor paused the video at the moment when the reaching hand withdrew and asked a roomful of teenagers what changed, then let them discover the answer. The air did. Veterans watched in small circles and nodded at the way a stance can carry more training than a speech, the way a man's center of gravity can tell a room what's safe. Online, the usual noise softened enough to make room for gratitude. The comments filled with ease from people who remembered an afternoon when someone offered structure without shame and left everyone better. The boys in the footage did not become villains in the telling. They became examples of accountability catching up to entitlement, a shift that mattered more than any call for punishment. Within days, their families met with officers and community leaders in rooms where apologies had to count for more than optics. The town's justice system moved with measured steps, calibrating consequences to teach rather than to brand. Community service was assigned in places where humility grows naturally, shelters where patience takes time, after-school programs where mentorship demands consistency, cleanup crews where effort erases its own footprints. The conversations went longer than the camera's memory, folding in themes that schools often struggle to teach: how power without empathy corrodes, how silence can wound, how stepping aside is not the same as stepping up. The moral equilibrium did not snap into place like a verdict. It eased back into position the way a shoulder finds its socket after a careful lift. Margaret's days recovered their rhythm with the help of time and the fidelity of routine. Her hands stopped trembling by habit and returned to trembling only when emotion asked for it, the kind of tremor that signals a heart finding its strength again. Scout shook off the afternoon's residue with a morning at the lake, his joy rushing back in the zigzag of a dog who trusts the world once more. When a local reporter sat in her living room with a camera that tried to disappear, Margaret spoke about gratitude the way people talk about shelter, not fancy but essential. She described the neighborhood in details the audience could feel: the bakery that smells like Sundays, the fountains missed on a hot day. And then she described the moment when a stranger stood between her and harm without laying claim to the story. She did not name him as anything other than a man who remembered his duty when others forgot theirs. The clip of her voice, steady and unembellished, traveled almost as widely as the original video. Ethan refused attention with the same discipline he had used to calm the square. The calls came from producers who promised to keep it respectful, from organizations that wanted his story for their newsletters, from people offering to turn him into a symbol he did not want to be. He let the phone ring. He packed a small bag and drove the 2-lane road toward the lake that had taught him how to breathe again when sleep came in shards. The cabin waited with its familiar, honest needs: a door hinge that preferred oil to ceremony, a window that stuck in humidity, a path that always collected pine needles no broom could fully persuade to relocate. He set the bag down, opened the window, and let the wind enter like an old friend who knew when not to talk. In the evenings, he walked the shoreline as the last light loosened its hold on the water. He considered the complicated mathematics of redemption without expecting it to solve. He knew that one good act does not cancel one bad day. Life does not balance itself like an equation on a chalkboard. But he also knew that proportion matters, that restoring order in one afternoon restores something inside the person who refuses to let harm take root. He felt the men he had carried in memory settle around him the way veterans say they sometimes do, close enough to be felt, far enough to let him keep walking. He did not need the world to confirm who he was. The work itself confirmed it. The story outgrew him, as all true stories must. It turned into a case study for departments training officers on presence and tone. It became a slide in a seminar on conflict resolution titled "What Calm Can Do." It traveled into veteran circles where it was received less as news and more as recognition, a nod across a crowded room from one life to another. In high school assemblies, the moment when the hand retreated drew quiet from students who understood intuitively that something rare had occurred, strength that did not require a scar to prove itself. People began to talk about decency not as a soft word but as a sturdy one, the kind of word you can set a day upon. Through all of this, the town adjusted. The market lane found a new etiquette, not brittle with fear but elastic with care. Strangers made room without calculation, and when laughter arrived it did so as celebration instead of Claim. Margaret returned to the square with Scout, and the fountain's mist felt like it belonged to her again. Those who had watched and hesitated now watched and moved, their bodies learning the choreography of timely kindness. The boys showed up to their service appointments and, slowly, began to act like the kinds of young men they would later want to remember being. The lesson landed without spectacle. Dignity protected in time becomes a community's most useful story. The world kept calling Ethan a Navy SEAL because names are easier to carry than complexities, but in the quiet spaces where stories finish their sentences, Margaret knew him as something more precise, a man restored by compassion, whose discipline served mercy before pride. In that knowing lived the real legacy, not a headline, not a label, but a pattern others could practice when their day arrived. The video became an origin point for courage that refuses to be loud, proof that a single act, correctly measured, can tilt a town toward its better version of itself. On a rainy morning at the cabin, a plain envelope waits on Ethan's doorstep. Inside, a single note rests in careful handwriting. You reminded me that goodness still exists. So if stories like this still move something inside you, don't let them fade. Share this with someone who still believes quiet goodness can change the world. And before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. If you had been there that day, would you have stepped forward or stayed silent?